All right, strap in, everyone, because we are going deep today. Deep into Sartre, that is.
That's right. We're diving into the imaginary, and to be even more
Oh,
specific,
yeah, we got to be precise here.
we're working with the 2004 edition, the one Arlette Elkim Sartre revised.
If you're into philosophy of mind, I mean, really into it.
You're in the right spot. This one's for the hardcore folks.
So our mission today is to really unpack Sartre's ideas about mental images.
But, and this is the cool part, we're going to connect this to everyday experiences.
Yeah, I'm talking about getting lost in a good book, even those weird fever dreams.
Sartre takes on this huge idea from his time. The idea that mental images are basically like pictures in our heads, just mirroring how we see the world.
Ah, so like a little mental projector screen playing our thoughts.
Yeah, something like that. But Sartre calls this the illusion of immanence, and he just rips it apart.
Interesting. So it's not that simple, huh?
Not even close. Thinking of images this way totally misses how our minds actually connect with the world. Sartre critiques two big theories that were popular back then.
Okay, lay it on me.
One is resemblance-based, that images have to look like what they represent. The other is convention-based, like Nelson Goodman's idea that we basically read images based on symbols we've learned.
Hold on. So he's saying both of those are wrong. Like, even if a picture looks exactly like a tree, that's not how my mind's actually picturing a tree.
You got it. To illustrate this point, Sartre brings in a powerful example from Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida. It's where Barthes talks about seeing a photo of his mom from when she was a kid.
Oh, that's got to be tough.
Yeah, well, she had already passed away, and Barthes talks about how her kindness is somehow present in the picture, even though she's not there.
Okay, wow. So it's not just about the visual stuff, but the emotional weight we bring to images too.
You're catching on quick. And that leads us to a term that often trips people up. Sartre's irreal concept.
Yeah, I got to admit that word always throws me for a loop.
Right, so Sartre is saying both mental pictures and actual pictures are way more complex than just copies or symbols. And with irreal, he's not saying these objects are unreal, like they don't exist at all.
Okay, so what's he getting at then?
It's more like they exist specifically because they're imagined. It doesn't matter if they have a counterpart in the real world or not.
So, like, when I vividly picture myself winning a Grammy, that Grammy is irreal, not because it can't happen, but because right now it's only in my mind.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Sartre doesn't just base this on, armchair philosophizing.
Right, he's not just making stuff up.
He's very rigorous.
Mm-hmm.
He dives into his own introspection, examining his experiences, but he also pulls in experimental psychology from the Würzburg School and Alfred Binet.
So he's combining that first-person experience with hardcore scientific observation. Interesting approach.
Exactly. It's what he calls phenomenological psychology, and it's how he gets at the core of how we perceive, conceive, and imagine.
Okay, so break that down for me a bit more.
Well, he argues that we can direct all three of those mental actions, perceiving, conceiving, imagining, towards the same object, but our experience of it will be radically different depending on which mode we're using.
Okay, I need a concrete example here. Like, say we're talking about a patch of grass. How would those three work?
Perfect example. So if you're perceiving it directly, you're taking in all those sensory details, color, texture, maybe even the smell. But if you're imagining that patch of grass, it becomes what Sartre calls intuitive absent.
Intuitive absent. All right, you're losing me a bit.
Think of it like this. You can picture the grass in your mind, but at the same time, you know it's not actually right there in front of you. There's a gap.
Ah, okay. So it's both in my mind, but T also not right there in front of me. Got it.
Right. And if you're just thinking about the concept of grass, it's even more abstract. You're not focused on a specific patch with all its little details. You're dealing with grass as a general category.
So each way of mentally approaching this patch of grass reveals something different about it. A mental image is not the same as perceiving it or just thinking the word grass.
You nailed it. And that's where that idea of nothingness comes in. That gap between the image and the real object, that's essential to the image itself.
So how does Sartre illustrate this nothingness in action? I'm really trying to wrap my head around this.
Well, he uses this fascinating progression of examples. Each one has what he calls increasingly impoverished matter. Imagine a comedian imitating a celebrity, like Frank Quenet doing Maurice Chevalier.
Okay, I can picture that.
The visual matter isn't actually Chevalier, right? It's Frank Quenet using her body and actions to evoke his image.
Kind of like a caricature where they exaggerate certain features.
Exactly. And as we move to more schematic forms of representation, think simple line drawings, the matter becomes even more impoverished. There's less and less resemblance to the actual object.
but we can still grasp the image.
Oh.
It's wild to think about it that way. He even uses those weird entoptic lights we see when our eyes are closed as an example. You know those things that can turn into those hypnagogic images when you're drifting off to sleep?
Precisely. And for Sartre, even those fleeting abstract images are actively constructed by our minds, drawing on our knowledge and intentions.
Hold on, so even when I'm half asleep and seeing those weird light blobs, my mind is still in the driver's seat. It's turning them into images based on what I already know.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of Sartre's most brilliant insights, the role of movement in shaping mental images.
Okay, movement. This is where I start to get lost. How does movement fit into a mental picture?
He argues that our bodily movements can become integrated into the very structure of an image. Think about the Miller-Lyer illusion. You know those arrows pointing in different directions that make lines look longer or shorter even though they're the same length?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or try imagining tracing a square in the air with your finger.
Okay, I get it. Even though my finger isn't actually moving, when I imagine tracing that square, the movement is still somehow present in the mental image.
Exactly. It's what Sartre calls an imaged property of the object. It's as if the movement itself were being imagined rather than physically performed.
Man, this is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about how my mind works.
It's powerful stuff, right? And it leads Sartre to some fascinating research done by a psychologist named Flatt. He studied what he called symbolic schemas.
Symbolic schemas, what are those?
They're these abstract spatial forms that people reported experiencing when they were trying to understand complex concepts.
Wait, you mean trying to understand an idea can create an actual shape in your mind? Like what you're thinking about has a visual form.
That's what Flatt found. Like one person trying to grasp the concept of compromise. Imagine two bodies sliding towards each other and then merging into one. Another person, when they thought about the poet Baudelaire, they saw a splash of blue-green color against a dark background. It represented, and I'm quoting here, Baudelaire-specific decadence.
That's wild. So these schemas aren't just random. They're actually representing the core of the idea.
Exactly. And for Sartre, these schemas back up his ideas about the role of movement, knowledge, and emotions in making mental images. It shows how our whole being is involved in understanding our body, mind, feelings, all of it.
My mind is officially blown. So we've covered irreal objects, these mind-bending schemas. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of what Sartre has to say, though.
We are, but before we get to his conclusions about how all this ties into thought itself, let's take a second to let these ideas sink in.
Agreed. Let's take a breather.
All right, so picking up where we left off, we were talking about those symbolic schemas, almost like mental diagrams.
Yeah, that really blew me away. Thinking isn't just some cold, logical process happening in isolation.
Exactly. And that leads Sartre to a huge idea about how images and thought relate, especially when we're not really aware of how we're thinking.
So we're going beyond just mental pictures now. We're talking about how we actually use those pictures to understand stuff.
Precisely. Sartre argues that even though a mental picture isn't the same thing as pure thought, it can be like a stand-in, an equivalent for thought, when we're just operating on that unreflective level. You know, how we think most of the time.
Okay, can you give me an example? I'm having a hard time picturing how an actual picture can substitute for a thought.
Sure thing. Imagine you're trying to understand the idea that oppression breeds resistance. Sartre uses the example of picturing a compressed spring. The more you compress it, the more potential energy it builds up, ready to spring back.
Okay. I see. The image of the spring becomes a way to grasp this abstract political concept.
Exactly. But here's the catch, and this is crucial. Sartre also warns that relying too much on images can be tricky. Our understanding can get limited by the specific properties of the image, rather than the abstract concept it's supposed to represent.
So sticking with that spring example, I might miss other ways that oppression plays out, or how resistance takes shape, if I'm just thinking about a spring.
Exactly. It's like the image becomes a crutch, helpful at first, but potentially limiting if we don't realize it's just a symbol. And this brings us to another really fascinating aspect of Sartre's work, his analysis of images in art.
Yes, we touched on this earlier with the Barthes example, and that whole irreal concept. I'm definitely ready to dig deeper into that. What makes art so special for Sartre?
Okay, so prepare yourself, because he argues that the aesthetic object, the thing we experience as beautiful, is always an irreality.
Wait, so when I look at a painting, the beauty isn't actually in the paint on the canvas.
That's precisely what Sartre is saying. He uses the example of a portrait of Charles VIII. The physical canvas, the brushstrokes, the pigments, those are all real material things. But what we find aesthetically pleasing, what moves us, is the image of Charles VIII, the way he's depicted.
So the beauty is in how the painting makes me imagine Charles VIII, not in the physical object itself.
You got it. And for Sartre, that image is an irreality because it's created by an act of imagination. It's my mind, my consciousness, that brings this aesthetic object into being.
So I'm co-creating the beauty through my own imagination. That's a pretty radical
It
idea.
is, and he believes this applies to all forms of art, literature, music, theater, you name it.
Okay, I'm curious. How does this irreal beauty work with something like a novel? The words are real, the story is made up. Where does this image come in?
Think about reading. The words are like signs guiding your imagination. As you read, you're constructing mental pictures of the characters, the setting, the events. You're actively creating that world of the novel in your mind.
And that world, the world I create in my mind as I read, that's the irreality Sartre is talking about.
Exactly. It only exists because your imagination is bringing it to life. And it's within that irreal world that you experience the beauty, the drama, all the emotional depth of the story.
This irreal concept is so intriguing, but I gotta admit, it still feels a little slippery. Any other examples that could help nail it down?
Sure. Think about a theatrical performance. You have real actors on a real stage wearing real costumes, but the characters they portray, that world they create on stage, it's all irreality.
So as an audience member, I'm participating in this irreal world, using my imagination to bring it to life along with the actors.
Right. And this actually connects to that famous debate about the paradox of the actor. Some argue that actors don't truly believe they are the characters they play. Others say that many actors do get so immersed in their roles that they actually experience the emotions as if they were real.
I see where you're going with this. Sartre's idea of the irreal helps explain this paradox. The actor doesn't have to literally believe they are the character. They're using their body, their voice, their emotions, all of it as tools to create an image of that character for the audience.
Exactly. It's through this act of creation, this irrealization of the self, that the aesthetic object, the character, the story comes into being. It's a collaboration between the actor and the audience, both contributing to the construction of this irreal world on stage.
Whoa, this has some pretty big implications for how we think about art and reality. Sartre is right. The beauty we experience isn't just reflecting something that's already out there in the world. It's something we're actively creating with our imaginations.
And that leads him to a pretty bold conclusion. He says, the real is never beautiful. Beauty, as a value, can only be applied to the imaginary. It's like when we experience beauty, we're stepping back from the everyday world and immersing ourselves in this realm of imagination.
So it's not that I don't care about the actual object. It's that my attention is focused on this irreal image I've created in my mind. And that's where the beauty lies.
Exactly. And that explains why we often feel a sense of detachment or disinterest when we're contemplating something beautiful. It's not apathy, it's a shift in our consciousness, a turning towards the irreal.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. This reframes art completely. It's not just entertainment or decoration. It's a way to tap into a totally different way of experiencing the world. It expands how we understand ourselves and everything around us.
You got it. And it also explains why it's so hard to define beauty or come up with some objective checklist for it. Because beauty isn't just a feature of the object itself. It comes from this dynamic interaction between the object and the person experiencing it.
But this raises a big question. If beauty is all about the irreal, does that mean we can never find beauty in the real world?
That's a great question, and Sartre definitely tackles this head on. He acknowledges that we can take an aesthetic attitude towards real things, like a sunset or a mountain range. But when we do, we're not experiencing that thing in its full reality. We're experiencing it as a kind of stand-in, an analogon, he calls it, that points towards an irreal image.
Can you break that down for me? What does it mean to experience something real as an analogon?
Think about watching a sunset. The colors, the light, the clouds, those are all real physical phenomena. But when we find the sunset beautiful, we're not just passively observing it. We're actively shaping those elements into an aesthetic object through our imagination.
So I'm adding in my own emotions, memories, associations. I'm creating a kind of irreal sunset image in my mind.
Precisely. And it's in that irreal image where the beauty resides. It's a transformation of the real, seeing the world anew through the lens of imagination.
This makes me think about those times when you're just struck by the beauty of something completely unexpected, like a crack in the sidewalk, the way light hits a leaf, even a fleeting expression on someone's face. It's like those everyday things suddenly become more.
Yes. And in those moments, you're not just seeing the object, you're experiencing it as a symbol, an analogon of something bigger, something that goes beyond the immediate reality of what's right in front of you.
This all circles back to that idea of the nothingness we discussed earlier. That every image carries a certain nothingness within it. It's like the image is always pointing to something beyond itself, something we can't directly perceive.
And that nothingness, that gap, is exactly what makes room for imagination. It lets us see past the surface to create new meanings and connections. We've only just begun to explore Sartre's The Imaginary, but before we jump into part 3, let's take a quick break to let all of this sink in.
Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into Sartre's The Imaginary. We've talked about how we actively create beauty with our imaginations.
And how even seeing something like a sunset involves this complex interplay between what we see and that irreal image we build in our minds.
Right, right. So for this last part, let's bring all of this down to earth a bit.
Yeah, let's get practical.
How do these ideas about the imaginary actually play out in our everyday lives?
Well, for Sartre, the same principles that apply to art are also at work, even when we're not being intentionally artistic.
Okay, I think I get that. But can you give me like a real-world scenario?
Think about daydreaming.
Okay, sure. We all do that.
When you're lost in a daydream, you're creating a whole world in your mind.
And those imagined situations, the people, all of it, those are all irreal objects in Sartre's view.
Exactly. They don't exist in the same way, like this coffee mug exists.
Right. Tangible and all that.
But even though they're not real in that concrete way, they can still have a huge impact on us, on our thoughts, feelings, even our actions.
It's true. Some of my daydreams are way more vivid and emotionally intense than what's actually happening around me.
And that intensity, for Sartre, is what shows us the power of the imaginary. It's not just escapism, it's a way of actively shaping how we understand our reality.
So it's more than just a little mental amusement. It's a way of engaging with the world, even if it's on this irreal level.
Right. And this ties into what we were saying before. The irreal isn't just a watered-down version of the real. It has its own unique power.
We talked about finding beauty in the irreal. But can we find other things too?
Absolutely. Think about fear, anxiety, even desire. Those can all exist in that realm as well.
Hold on. So you're saying our fears, our anxieties, they're also created by our imagination.
It's a key insight from Sartre. He'd say, we don't just react to threats in the world. We give those threats meaning. And that meaning is also shaped by our imagination.
So like when I totally freak out about a presentation I have to give, it's not the actual presentation that's scaring me. It's the disaster scenario I'm playing out in my head.
Exactly. Those worries, the exaggerations, they're all coming from the imaginary. We create these irreal objects, imagined scenarios, potential dangers. And even though they're not real in this moment, they can trigger very real emotions.
So even though the fear might be based on something irreal, the feeling itself is very real. This is making me rethink how we deal with anxiety.
And that's why Sartre believes understanding the imaginary is so important. It's not just about art or daydreams. It's about understanding how we experience and interpret the world around us, how we create meaning, and how we react emotionally.
So this brings up a big question then. If our fears, our anxieties are coming from this irreal realm, does that mean we can control them?
That's a tough one, and Sartre wouldn't give you an easy answer. But he would say that we're not just puppets of our imagination. We have the power to reflect on our mental processes, to notice how we're building these irreal objects.
So it's not about shutting down our imagination. It's about being aware of it.
Precisely. And this awareness, for Sartre, is a big part of what it means to be free. The more we understand our own minds, the more freedom we have to shape our reality, including how we deal with those fears and anxiety.
Wow. We've really covered a lot today. It's amazing how Sartre challenges our assumptions about art, reality, even just the way we experience the world.
We've learned that the irreal isn't just for fantasy or escaping reality. It's a force that shapes our emotions, thoughts, and even actions.
That by becoming more aware of our own imaginations, we can actually unlock more freedom and agency in our lives.
Exactly. And with that, we hope you've enjoyed this journey into the fascinating world of the imaginary. Remember what Sartre would say: keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep imagining.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.